Because I know, of course, he was in exile for 29 years.
Right.
So many people had come to know of him while he wasn't even around, particularly for those of you that were operating here in the country. So talk to him about the first times that you've heard about him and then the first time that you actually personally met him.
Well, obviously, I mean, his reputation preceded him. When I was a young journalist who started out working at the Windhoek Advertiser in 1976. And as everybody knows, his depictions, certainly in the Western world, were as this terrorist leader, this communist. You know, so he was always pictured in his camouflage fatigues and so on. So one had the impression of a larger-than-life, quite scary type of liberation leader. I first met him in 1983 in Paris, and I remember that day very clearly. I was taken along to meet him by a good late friend of mine, Mokanedi Klabanello. And once I was inside, he was there with the late President Tage Geingob, and also the then leader of the OAU Liberation Committee, Brigadier Hashim Mbita. And the three of us sat down and had a long discussion, and I interviewed him, and that was really the first time. And I was intrigued at the time, because most people who know the president, the late president, know that he did not like alcohol. And so as I walked in, he pointed to a tray of drinks and said to me, would I like a drink? And I said to him, no, thank you, but if there's tea available, I'd be very happy to have a cup of tea. And he was absolutely thrilled. A big smile broke across his face, and I think I broke the ice, and I think somehow I got 10 out of 10 from him at that moment.
So that first impression was a pinnacle point in the start of the relationship.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And so from then on, it was a very warm discussion. He'd obviously followed a lot of my journalistic career in the preceding, 7 years, on the Windhoek Advertiser and then later the Windhoek Observer from 1978. And he knew that I covered SWAPO politics inside the country extensively. I was always there at the SWAPO rallies that were violently broken up in many instances by South African security forces. And so my reputation as a journalist who was outspoken in her condemnation of apartheid preceded me. And so it was clear that he felt a kind of trust in me, that he invited me to meet him and later to interview him. So we started off on a very good note.
In terms of that, I think, Gwen, and I think for many of us that got into journalism, there's a certain level of idealism that also follows you when you get into media and journalism in particular. Reflect a little bit on that as well. I mean, you started off with the advertising, like you said, in 76, and then now you're in 83 now, interviewing Sam Nujoma. Between those 2 years, what had happened to have now the start of the Namibia newspaper in 1985, to really say, look, okay, now I've been the journalist, but I think we need now a platform where we can actually continue to drive this message home.
Yeah, well, of course, my story is not the story of the day, but just to be very brief, I started off on the Windhoek Advertiser, and at the time that the Turnhulle Constitutional Conference was on, in 1976, 1977, which culminated in the founding of the Democratic Turnhulle Alliance under Dirk Mudge in 1977, political pressures started to come down on myself and the then editor of the Windhoek Advertiser, Hannes Smith. We were viewed as being too pro-SWAPO because we condemned an internal settlement for Namibia. We wanted an internationally recognized settlement that obviously included SWAPO, and we felt that any settlement that precluded the liberation movement would not work. And so we were very outspoken and critical about that, and so eventually we learned that the DTA, or forces behind the DTA and slush funds from South Africa, were taking over the Advertiser. So Smitty and I were asked to either conform editorially, which we both refused to do, and so we left the Advertiser. And I remember both of us feeling fairly hopeless. We realized then that there was no media that was outspoken, that was trying to show the human face, if you like, of SWAPO. And so it took a week. And Smitty called me after a couple of days and said, let's start another newspaper. And we started the Windhoek Observer. And the first edition actually came out on Kasinga Day, May 4, 1978. And of course, to cut a long story short once again, after another 6 years of working at the Observer, during which time I traveled quite frequently abroad to meet with President Nujoma and the SWAPO leadership in exile, the pressure came onto Smitty himself, mainly from the South African appointed Administrator General at the time, that my political reporting on SWAPO was resulting in a lack of advertising, and he threatened boycotts of the Observer. And so really, for economic reasons, Smitty then demoted me as political editor, as I was at the time, and it wasn't long before I left. And it took another year of kind of just freelancing and so on before I decided we should start the Namibian, which was not easy to do at that time. But I realized that then the media landscape was closing in, and that South Africa, if it wasn't directly in control of the media, then a lot of the media in existence at the time was in favor of continued occupation.
And in terms of that, I mean, just talking about the overall role and that the media had also played in terms of just shaping the narratives, particularly in the late 80s around independence. You know, for the layman on the street, journalism, you're required to be balanced in terms of what you're reporting. But the time that we were, I think, of course, we know before independence that we were in a certain political landscape. How was it? How difficult or easy was it for one to be able to balance the narratives while you know for a fact that, look, this is the position that we've taken.
Right.
At the same time as well, within that context of the Cold War, where countries were now being forced to take a side. Are you communist? Are you socialist? Are you with the East? Are you with the West? Just reflect a little bit on the role of the media and that balance that you had to play, and having a leader like Sir Nujoma that was accessible to be able to tell that story. I like that angle of human face that you had mentioned a little bit earlier as well.
It was always a very difficult balance to strike. As a newspaper, especially when we founded the Namibian, we did so for the main reason of promoting independence for Namibia and self-determination. That was our goal in actually starting the newspaper. So we were unequivocally biased, if you like, in favor of independence. Covering both SWAPO on the one hand and the South African security forces on the other was always fraught. Obviously, we covered a lot about the atrocities that were happening under the jackboot of apartheid up in northern Namibia, in particular in those years, and that was difficult. That was the kind of reporting that got us a few bans in the ensuing years, also got us firebombed and, you know, a lot of us jailed and threatened in various ways. So it was not an easy path to follow. At the same time, we wanted to hold SWAPO accountable. So we would, fortunately or unfortunately, I suppose we had a natural bias towards the liberation movement at the time because of what was happening in the country. It was clear for all to see that South Africa's main goal was to silence the voice of SWAPO, whether it was up in the northern regions where the war was raging, or down south where SWAPO tried to hold rallies, where its leadership were continually arrested and detained without trial. So it was kind of difficult to get balance in a time like that. But I think we always aspired to that. We had to be careful when we covered things like atrocities on the part of the Defense Forces. For example, one of our front page photographs, because people had spoken a lot about how the South African forces would parade the bodies of dead SWAPO insurgents on the side of Caspers and sort of patrol through the towns gloating about the death of the insurgents. And the Defense Forces and the police would both deny that it ever happened. And finally, of course, we got a photograph to show it was happening, put it over the front page, really big, and phoned the police. We didn't tell them we had the photograph, but we called them again to say, are you still doing this sort of thing? And they said, no, we never do that. And of course, we called their bluff and the paper was banned immediately the next day. And so it was a constant fight all the time to kind of strike that balance and be there basically for the people of Namibia who were living under this nightmare. and in the north, a dusk to dawn curfew, and where life was incredibly difficult under South African occupation. So it was difficult to be objective about the conditions under which people were living at the time.
But now that objectivity now gets called on at the advent of independence. So in 1990 now we get to our independence. Before 1990, obviously, like you said, there was a natural bias towards, SWAPO and the independence of Namibia, or this fight for independence of Namibia. Now comes 1990, and we are expected to follow the letter of the law, to be objective in terms of our dealings, in terms of how we report. Talk to me a little bit about that transition, where many people had also said that Namibia has been a bit of a unicorn in the sense that immediately after independence, we didn't have any attack per se, or jailing, for example, or journalism, or overt action or government really trying to take control of the media in the country. Just when that switch happened, and many have said that it's sort of like a unicorn situation that we've experienced as a country. Talk to me a little bit about that and the role that Sam Nujoma had played as a leader to ensure that once independence has come, the media is still allowed to do their work, and now in turn be able to start criticizing the government that has taken over.
Right. Well, obviously, at independence, Sam Nujoma did preside over the adoption of a constitution that was described as a shining light on the African continent. As most people, or many of the young people perhaps don't know today, but at that time, most of Africa was still under autocratic rule when Namibia gained its independence. South Africa was still in the grip of apartheid. So the scenario, both south of us and further north, was not a very good one. So Namibia came with this constitution, with a Bill of Rights, with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, rule of law, democracy, these sort of things. It was really quite something at the time. And of course, one cannot negate the late president's role in all of this, in bringing about a constitution that really provided for these things. And so for us at the Namibian, it was a time when we had to sit down and reassess. When we started the newspaper in 1985, we didn't really know or think that we would actually make it until independence. I mean, the threats came at us from all sides, but we did. We made it there. And of course, we were donor funded up to independence. And at independence, we were told, well, now that's the time the donor funding will cease. So it was very, very difficult for us not only to find our feet in an independent country, in our peaceful, democratic country, but also to sort of fight for sustainability of the media. We had to survive, or we would die. And so that was a very, very difficult transition. The white business community at the time was obviously still very anti the Namibian. Yeah. And I think it took a little while before finally we began to get some advertising and so on. So we had to sort of face a fight for survival on several fronts. And then as far as our editorial policy was concerned, the Namibian had always been strongly independent, even though, as I told you, our bias was towards the people of Namibia, but that was translated into a bias towards SWAPO. And so once we became independent, we thought, right, SWAPO is now the government. We need to hold that government to account on its promises and pledges, in as much as we did with the South African government before. And this is where I think a lot of fundamental misunderstandings came into play.
And I know that, of course, you had also had a bit of a brush during his time as president as well. I understand a banning at some stage of government advertising to the Namibian.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, I think at independence, everything started out on the right note. The late president was very conciliatory. It was clear he was very deliberate about wanting a parliament or a national assembly that crossed all the ethnic groups of the country. It was clear. He was going to try and push back on that SWAPO is an Avambo movement and they're going to dominate everything. He wanted to bring about a more inclusive society. He came about with a policy of national reconciliation, which of course, with hindsight, we can criticize because it wasn't always adhered to. But the thought behind it was a very nice one, in an attempt to heal the wounds of war and heal the very deep divisions that had come about among the Namibian population as a result of the war. And so we started on a good note, and we were very positive about what was happening. But it wasn't long until, obviously, we had to start keeping SWAPO to account. And I know in the earlier interview, you mentioned, among others, the sort of foray into war in the DRC, which was Nujoma's decision to go and prop up, if you like, late President Laurent Kabila. That was something that was very controversial here in Namibia, and we editorialized against it. We said we had no business in this foreign war. And there were other issues where slowly but surely we kind of butted heads with the late president on a number of issues. It included that. It also included, because of his very close relationship with late President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the sort of who started attacking gays there, so Nujoma followed suit in Namibia. So editorially speaking, there were a couple of areas where we began to sit and criticize government and what was happening and hold them to that Bill of Rights that we'd been so proud of to have in Namibia. And so, as I say, with hindsight, I saw more of President Nujoma in the liberation years prior to independence than I did post-independence. And kind of because of that, as I say, we'd started out with a very warm relationship. He trusted me implicitly, but he somehow felt that I and or the newspaper had turned against SWAPO, which was not the case. We wanted to say when good things were being done, but we also wanted to speak freely when we felt things we were going wrong. And that was, I think, often misconstrued. So I was cast into the political wilderness fairly early on after independence. I was not, and even have not been to date, a very frequent guest at State House. That included President Nujoma, President Pohamba, and President Geingob. I think I can count on the fingers of one hand the times that I've been there. But it was because I was then construed as being anti-government. And of course, just after independence, when I was offered the post of Minister of Information and Broadcasting by SWAPO, and I turned it down, that I think I kind of really put myself in the wilderness after that. And if you're not with us, you're against us, was kind of something like the feeling that abounded. But I must say, going back to President Nujoma, I was very delighted and very thankful. Although in the intervening years when we've not really been on speaking terms, there were times I tried to get to see him. They weren't successful, but when the president was diagnosed and was in hospital with COVID, late President Geingob invited me to go along with him and fellow cabinet members to meet with President Nujoma in hospital at the time. And that same old smile that I saw in 1983 was again on his face when we met in the hospital. So I was very pleased in a way that we kind of had a rapprochement of sorts after decades of kind of working together and then not being on the best of terms.
I think, Gwen, just in conclusion, we know, of course, that we have, as a country, collectively maintained quite a good standing when it comes to press freedom since independence. No journalists really had been ostracized to that extent where they've been jailed and so forth, like we've seen in other countries. What is how do you want him to be remembered within the media space, particularly by a lot of the young journalists that might not be familiar with the kind of work that had to go in, particularly from political leadership, to bring us to the standard of media freedom that we're enjoying here in the country, and the standing that we have built in terms of reputation globally?
Well, I think it's safe to say that commitment to press freedom, it's not always been perfect, as I've outlined to you, even the ban on the Namibian and so on, has really been fairly intact since the moment of our Constitution's adoption back in 1989. I think SWAPO have held quite true to press freedom. I often wonder how much it had to do with the fact that there was an outspoken voice within Namibia in favor of self-determination and independence back in the day that warmed SWAPO, if you like, to the fact of media freedom. But I think generally speaking, we've kept true to that. It is absolutely true to say that there have been no arbitrary arrests of journalists and certainly no deaths since independence. Things are not perfect. And as you know, the media has its own struggles right now. And I think going forward, it would be great if the government, which made a very strong commitment, also when we adopted the Windhoek Declaration on a free and independent African press in 1991, that commitment was especially held close by President Geingob, who was probably the first president to be outspokenly in favor of press freedom. It's not to say he always liked the media. Politicians very seldom always do. But the fact was he held true to that. And I'm hoping with the new dispensation coming in March that commitment will hold true going forward. Thank
you very much, Gwen, for making time out to join me this afternoon.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Well, veteran journalist, pioneering journalist, whichever word you want to use. Of course, there's no conversation that we can have about the history of media in our country without bringing in Gwen Lister to reflect a little bit on that. Of course, talking to us about her personal relationship with the president before independence and just the shaping of the media under his leadership right after independence. Stay with us as we continue to cover the life and times of this liberation struggle icon. When we come back after the break, President of the IPC, Dr. Banduleni Itulak, now comes and joins me, and I'm quite excited to reflect a little bit, particularly on the before independence years with him as well. Stay with us as we continue with this coverage. Don't forget, of course, to engage us on our social media platforms. We are not only broadcasting here on TV, but also online. Check out our website, the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation, as well as our social media platforms for constant updates as we celebrate the life and times of our founding father. Stay with us.